This is probably the hardest video that I've ever made. It's the video that I wake up every single day, my entire life, wanting to make. The realization, either not being able to articulate, which was rare, or trying to figure out how I could come to this place of convincing myself that I could simply convince myself that this isn't real, that this isn't what reality is, and further, that there must be something fundamentally wrong with me as a light-skinned male, as a 6 foot tall male, as a physically strong male, as somebody who, at least by some accounts, has a relatively high IQ and an equal, if not higher, emotional quotient, if you get into Goldman and so forth. I'm a mastermind on the Keirsey temperament disorder, or the Myers-Briggs, if you will. I took that personality test about 10 years apart. I also took IQ tests, though they were online, several years apart, and scored fairly high. So, and done well in proctored exams that I didn't have to study much for. I didn't ace them, didn't try to ace them. I've done really well. I've collected awards every single month for 18 months straight as the top trainer at my particular regional location, and even won the regional award, and thought I was going to win the total award, until much of what happens today in every arena from these feudalistic capitalists who have politicized everything always and rigged the elections, rigged the system, if you will. And it didn't take me long to figure out that there was no way through. And of course, they want you to think that you are a defeatist, that you are a turncoat, that you are somehow flawed. And what they don't realize is, you know, the perspicacious mind, the mind that's always thinking, trying to rationalize, and seeing all these firewalls, all these dead ends that you reach over and over again. When you come to this, okay, you want me to think rationally, you want me to think more left brain, I'm going to do that. And you come to this place where you ultimately have to sacrifice not only your moral, ethical, virtue standing in society, but accept on the down low that this is the way things really are, right? That you have to come down to the level of this reality and convince yourself. In other words, you have to brainwash yourself and reprogram yourself and seek out companies, institutions, training programs, colleges, any alma mater that will reprogram and retrain you in a genteel sort of way. We can call it, you know, whatever we want to, right? Like, we can call it critical race theory and then switch the objectives. We can call this group Antifa, that, you know, stands for the fight against fascism, which is exactly what's happening right now in this country. What Trump holds is that to his last dying breath, he wants to institute a quasi-elite oligarch that will go into sort of an Ottoman-type empire. I mean, that's what's happening here, where all these rules, all these laws, and from a more esoteric or arcane perspective, when you really get into the Kabbalistic magic, Kabbalah, and you start to see what's really happening here, that this goddess isn't just being suggested. This Sophia, this mind of Hathor, is being this virtuous Mother Mary, you know, this archetype where you are supposed to accept the multifarious, multi-tiered, multi-layered personalities of not only your wife, but your daughter, your sister, your niece. You get where I'm going with this? Where you start to look at the Morai and you see the 3 witches, and you see that these 3 witches have to be upheld in a celestial, cosmic way that link directly back to the zodiac. Everyone that has been allowed to step forth supplicated and drew in to this convincing, all the way down to the people who are leading the path, such as Manly P. Hall, his indoctrination toward Rosicrucianism. Even the positive aspects of this obvious Thelemic solar cult worship seen in young Sadi, the Zoroaster, was in fact inculcated and infiltrated with the raising of, from his tween to pubescent years, a woman who came from the heavens took over his educations, his matriculation, right? His pedagogy. So the idea that somebody, you know, you get into DID, you get into this multi-personality displacement, this disorder of a fractionated self, that through the pons and the brainstem down to the vagus nerve, up to the olfactory and the limbic system and the amygdala, that surfaces, that provides the entirety of an individual. Because you have anything that will prompt even faster than the neocortical rationalistic mind, right? That thinks about things, goes slower in its processing, comes to such conclusions, realizes that no action at all is oftentimes the best action to take, to stay in this neutral capacity, or allowing the ontology to do what it does. And I say that there's something very unnatural about nature. And that is to say that the ontology is the aspect that is a computational system, that is spitting out a directive, that it is okay for all of the females, to the Morai, to the 3 stages of the witch named, to the Kabbalistic magic, for her to take on 8 different lovers. This is all part of it. That she is to segment herself in 8 different directions. She is to master 8 different principles and essentially, effectively, and quite literally establish the totality as close to it as possible toward a fully developed algorithm of self, right? We're talking about 8 distinct separate personalities. Or you could say the fractionation of 3 or 4 and the derivations of a chiral position, where there's this warlike persona also developed. This is very militaristic. In fact, I would venture to say that all things that are assumed male in our current culture, and all things that historically, arcanely, archaically serve as this sort of Arthurian legend, Knights of Malta, right? Going back through the Ophites and looking at the Sarmatians, and then Merovingians. Michael Tessarian did a really good take on this, where he's talking about warlocks. Essentially, we are a society that is raising up warlocks. We are taking witch lore literature, implementing it into legal action and law, creating civic arms that come from Black's Law Dictionary, spells, witchcraft, Kabbalistic spells and witchcraft, putting as our symbols, our signs from a doxastic point of view, right? I put up definitions in the community post, and isn't that odd that we call it a community, right? A commune, a community, a unity, but a forced unity. And that is that you have to supplicate, you have to capitulate, you have to bow down to, you have to come to the rationalization of the toxic feminine mind. I don't know if females traditionally were always this way, but what it appears as is that Genesis and other texts, pieces of literature, codices, are trying to tell you, almost like looking at a Rosicrucian piece of artwork or a Masonic piece of artwork, that based on the parallax view and your ability to see things multi-directionally, right, from different points of view, and to allow a different shift, photon collision rate of speed, shift light illumination to occur, where you are essentially, from this inference of the parallax view, you are completely, your perspective is in a completely different universal action or mode, right? So you take the lesser gradient of phi or phi, 1.618, right? You begin to craft what that golden mean would look like from its lesser prominence, right? All a man ever had to do was be incited, ignited with the drunken, horny predisposition that was brought about from this paracosm or this paramnesia of working your entire life, backbreaking work, dying young, and esteeming the prize, and being forced into thinking that this prize was this soiled, organic stench of the loins, right? And I really do believe that all of Friedrich Nietzsche's work pointed to this. I think that he understood this. And the first thing that this witch-or literature group will say is, you're homosexual, you're closeted, you're gay, right? Isn't this the first exact thing that they'll say? When you say that something's fundamentally flawed with women, what's the first thing? Oh, and the men aren't? Instead of ever thinking about it, right? But they think about it on their own. See, I had 3 sisters, 3 and a half sisters, a half sister. I predominantly trained women throughout most of my training career. I did endeavor into the esoteric side, just through the moral foundation and the traditions of how I think. I always saw more, and I always saw that there was more. And I gravitated toward, with the mentoring of some of my clients, actually, I gravitated toward Eckhart Tolle, even toward such ideas that heavily influenced my training career and what I focused on, which was Linus Pauling's orthomolecular nutrition, which is still heavily, refuted or subjectively looked at, but at its essence, what it's telling you is amino acids are the key, right? And the geometrical structures and how light interfaces, illuminates, and draws into this bioluminescence is, in fact, the goal, right? And that a state of mind, a diet, a religious tradition, what you do religiously throughout the day with fervor and focus, is what you become, right? So men are an adulterated aspect of whatever is inferred in the Y chromosome. I assume that that's the ramification. That's the cymatic connectivity of the physicality, the spirit, the soul, the mind, and it is a very weak transmission. To the point where what we're really prizing when we look at this machismo or this masculinity is in fact a fabrication. It's taking away the gradient of understanding, completely erasing. There's a complete eraser of men and what men do and what men think and what philosophies and actions come from this. You'd say, oh, that's bullshit. But when you look at it and you look at the philosophical underpinnings of how we approach, again, from a doxastic point of view, it is entirely infected by this symbolism that is surrounding us. The circumpunct, right? The circumpunct to be put up on the sides of Masonic halls. That, in essence, could be looked at in a very complex, again, doxastic or even perspicacious, multifarious sort of way. Or you could just look at it like, that's a period, and the center of an ovum or a sphere, that's life. That's all we have to know. And when you look at this drawing in, and then you have the parameter of the two sides, the left and the right, that's a signification of time. That's telling you that this is a moment. This is a month, basically. You could look at it like that. There's many other ways you can look at it, obviously, but that circumpunct throughout time would invariably, through the Kabbalistic traditions of seeing things through movement, and even more so being able to see things through the traditions of, you could also look at the circumpunct as a conical tip, where you're looking at the most prominent peak coming toward you, or the period, the dot in the middle, as a representation that it's furthest away from you. Much of the Freemasons artwork, the Rosicrucian artwork, the tarot, if you will, much of these depictions show you exactly this, with the black and white checkerboard and these hallways that look like they could either be the side of a pyramidal structure. You see one side shadowed, oftentimes the left side, or if it's giving you another message, it might occult the right side, where it's like, this is a time, John Dee's hieroglyphic monad, where you need to look at things from a different perspective. We've reached another stage in the zodiacal era and repeat, right? But what has happened is these carbon copies of carbon copies of carbon copies of carbon copies are part of this so-called experiment. When we say experiment, I hate to use that word because there is so much directed energy flow and action occurring here that when we even begin to try and study the chi, the alloptic or oleic or really orgon energy fields, it's called something else. It's switched back up. It's not okay to call it electromagnetism anymore. It's not okay to call it strong or weak nuclear force, right? It's not okay to assume that gravity is an intrinsic aspect to physics. It's, so different rules are established to get people to think from a pedagogical, academic perspective, but the falsity of the entire board, right, stays latent and constant, right? To where you're supposed to perspicaciously think about the change in venue of one specific attribute that doesn't belong, and everything else in the field doesn't belong either. What we're talking about is the replacement of principles and why it's so important to look at base principles, because there really is nobody to look up to. There really are no archetypes that we can assumably say, this is John Wayne, this is Hemingway, this is Steinbeck, this is Marcus Aurelius. None of these people really existed in the way that it's been portrayed, right? And this antithetical aspect, or this chiral aspect to nature, is supposed to be from a point of view of a praxis of discovering, wow, this Jungian archetype of this dark shadowed self, this anima, animus, depending on if you're talking about a male or female. It's not. See, Jung was doing exactly that in this tradition that he was clouding this over. I believe that he, as well as many other people, Darwin, in fact, looks to have done this himself, why he hung on to that information and why he knew that he was clouding over. He knew, and then for Galton to go on and take that work and directly, bend it toward this eugenics effort, right? They wanted to create a pecking order of foot soldiers that would become warlocks to this witches order. And it is a lesser order. It is a controllable order. It is truly what this earth, this temporal realm is all about, is that this is not a man's world. This is a woman's world. And even more so, the men that you esteem as male, as machismo, as Ubermensch, are actually men, women, right? They're actually derivatives of the female or the feminine. And the feminine is entirely polluted. I know that there's a lot of refraction and there's a lot of fighting back for this, but this is the elephant in the room. This is what people talk around and evade. This is at the basis of what Jake Barber talks about, what Chris Bledsoe is discussing when they're talking about this divine feminine force and this very bent and malicious, pernicious aspect to the truth about this Hathor, Lady of the Wood. There's so many names. I've said it over and over again, Lilith, Eve, because there's this transitory aspect that once you look under the dress and finery, once the female in actuality that we were discussing at the time, Joan of Arc, any of these people, Mother Teresa, once you really get down to the dichotomy, the chirality, and then the Kabbalistic shifting mechanism, that this person isn't supposed to know themselves, that they are entirely a militarized weapon, that they have 8 segments and counting, that DID and this complete and total multifarious, multi-personality displacement is in fact what Michael Aquino, the Presidio, the Monarch Project, the child abuse and the CP that's taking place right now out in the open, hundreds of thousands into millions of children are inducted into this, that this is a militaristic effort, and that the adherence and the focus toward, people aren't going to like this at all, okay, toward a Jesus figure, a pure son, that a pure son could exist, is one of the biggest transcendental psyops in human history, okay? Because from a very surface perspective, it says, if you just believe in Jesus, if you just believe that a man could be pure, right? Outside the adulteration, that what you're really talking about, and this is discussed throughout the scriptures over and over again, the son of man, what the fuck's that all about? Well, look at the antithetical. What is the son of women? So that's the rest of us, that's the goyim, right? That if you came to the birth canal, and you look at it over and over again, you see the 2 pillars. You see the depiction you see the circumpunct. You see it over and over and over again, every story throughout history. It becomes boring and banal, right? Because it says the same thing over and over and over again. So the biggest indoctrination, right, is that you could create this derivation, this derivative of man, that you could essentially erase man and put small footprints and implications that he still exists or ever existed at all, as a solitary pursuit, as a philosophical effort, not just this blind Nietzschean call into a dark realm, into a dark space, looking into the abyss and it looks back at you. Did it ever exist at all? Or was the plan, the prototype, something that was cleaved off, right, from another place and put in not only through genetic engineering, but through moral and ethical traditions to make us think that the male component never existed at all, right? Because this is a woman's world. We are men, women. But women's wants, needs, and desires rule the day. There is no woman that is happy with one man. There is no woman that stays entirely with a singular man, yet men contractually down to the Black's Law Dictionary, right, through marriage, have to consign themselves to one woman, or they are seen as philandering, not just misogynist, but misanthropic agent provocateurs, as if they're like, programmed to destroy the female and all that is assumably pure and just and good. And it's like the purity, the justness, the goodness is never found with the female. It's found with the male who is beginning to wake up. But the thing that is left off, what we still haven't figured out, if you go into Descartes, if you're looking at Kant, if you're trying to look at the world through pure reason, if you're trying to use, what I put up here down in community post as well, was I was reminding people of a priori, synthetic a priori, a posteriori. We can't even get our thoughts straight as to what experience is, not the knowledge of experience, or this teleological outcome first type of thinking, right? We're all fucked up and have to create these philosophies so much so that this is the male perspective. This is what men pass down to other men. No wonder we're so fucked up. Fathers concurrently not teaching their sons jack shit, right? And still instilled in some sort of Y chromosomal blueprint, there's this inkling, this desire for this, not just this overtaking barbarian quest to rape and pillage and burn and to take over, but to create, to generate a better, purer society, right? And we're met with the same refraction over and over again, where females create this chaos, where females are pre-programmed to break society down and destroy it from the inside out, from family to family, from civic arm to civic arm. That is what the Statue of Liberty represents. Why it's a fucking man in drag, or maybe it's a woman, or what is it, right? It's this androgynous aspect that Mutwa was talking about, Credo Mutwa, in his famous interview with David Icke, where it's thought throughout all these traditions around the world, that we come from a hermaphrodite, right? Even the Buddha, when you look at the depictions of the 8 spokes and the tucked away and hidden genitalia, right? When you really look at it, you're going, are you trying to say that a real male is actually a female, maybe an alpha female, right? So the uncomfortable truth that Rosicrucians and the connectivity to Mormonism really forces us to be faced with, and this is the thing, is that I'm not casting the mind of under free will under the bus. I think that we are all equally as implicit, and it's very difficult to deal with these items on the table, and yet it's there every single day. We all hide from it. You've got to admit that this subject is exactly what you hide from every single day. And every channel that you watch, every political figure that you follow, takes a little stab or a poke at it, leads you back to this comfort level, and says, nah, you just got to send in your check and support us, right? We're going to keep you on the thin veneer. We're going to keep you on the surface. We're going to protect you away from this. And then once that political figure is gone and washed away, you're left with this sort of breakdown, this moral breakdown again, where you can't existentially crux yourself to something outside yourself, and that you have to go into this deep ontological yes, metaphysical endeavor where you have to fully develop the conceptualization that teleology leading into ontology, there's something extremely unnatural about nature, right? And there's something very pre-engineered going on with the application of the world around us, that this doesn't represent the universe, right? And I've said this before and I'll say it again, and it may sound like I'm just going off on a tangent here, but when you look out at the vastness of space and you think you're seeing something, right? Yeah, a lot of people talking about flat Earth, a lot of people going, I don't believe in space, and it's like, I don't care about listening to you unless you come with some really good proof, right? But the conceptualization that you would think in this rhetorical loop doesn't matter if physically flat Earth, which I don't believe in physically, right? But I do believe that pi and this flat Earth, flat time rhetoric is taking place and is depicted in the Ouroboros. I do believe that. I do believe that when we're looking out at space, that we could very well be looking at something that, like any cargo cult, we're completely incapable of looking at what we're actually trying to view, because not only the proteins in our eyes and the refraction off the light, and even in disparaging with light particles, that we may be living in a held institutional environmental situation, right, where specific particles, right, that we are exposed, and that the pervading field around us is only being exposed to specific engineered particles that can only exist here, that further segment and create this quasi-quadrant of reality and experience, barring off all of the pervading experience that might be existent outside of it. And so this is discussed over and over again when the term pleroma is used in the Coptic Gnostic text, right? This is inferred when we talk about any sphere, any orb, any bubble, right? So you really need to take the Kabbalistic Thelemic sun-worshipping magic, that it really just does come down to procreation and believing in a fantasy or a story that will promulgate and propagate a response. And what men are expected to do is just donate their sperm and die away and shut the fuck up. And that is the message that's going out over and over again.